We are at the Budapest Global Dialogue, and I am joined by Eric Lee, Chairman, Guancha, one of the biggest nationalist newspapers in China. You're also a venture capitalist. I'm also joined by Martin Urgosti. Did I get that right? Deputy State Secretary, Hungary. Welcome, and thank you for joining me for this discussion. We're going to discuss today the enduring dynamics between the United States and China, a great relationship that has significant implications on the world. And I think the context of this dialogue really is if this relationship can bring in international stability, or is there going to be some amount of tensions? So let me, in that context, start with the first question, and let me ask that question to you, Martin, first. What do you really think it means to attempt to create a more inclusive world when there are two superpowers like the United States and China, and the powers are divided between these two countries? What does it mean for an inclusive world?
Mm-hmm. I think the biggest challenge will be that how you can avoid either-or choices between the two great powers. Because obviously, the interests of countries like Hungary, small and medium-sized countries, are in the cooperation we can have with both of them at the same time. Of course, the Hungarian case is a little bit different because we are the members of both NATO and the EU, and that comes with certain liabilities. But the Hungarian strategy of connectivity has always been calling for the widest possible range of partners in order to modernize their economy, in order to contribute to the overall security and well-being of the world. And I just recently saw a term which is competitive coexistence, which could be a great summary of what we would expect from the two great powers, having a very little sway on either of them. Obviously, these countries are much bigger than us. But I think if they can find a way to peacefully coexist, but at the same time be competitors in critical sectors like technology, AI, financial services, and so on and so forth, that would be a very promising scenario, because at the end of the day, we all believe that competition is something which is good for society, it's good for humanity. And on that regard, that will lead to better solutions, both when it comes to overcoming joint problems like climate change, when it comes to how we can manage that kind of very tough situation we're seeing around the growth and then the collapse of global population, and so on and so forth. And obviously, neither of these two big countries is to disappear anytime soon. So they also have a fight to find a way to coexist. If we small countries can play any kind of a role in facilitating this, that's great. But at the end of the day, it's really up to them to decide what kind of relationship they want with each other.
Wonderful. Eric, I asked the same question to you. Of course, Martin has, spoken about competitive coexistence. Sounds really benign, and positive. But is that what you think as well?
Well, look, I think it's been fashionable of late to say that somehow the world is being divided into two camps, China and the United States. It's actually not what's happening. The world is not being divided into two spheres. Because, first of all, China is not interested in fighting for some kind of global dominance with the United States. It's just not happening. I think China is more interested in fostering a more multipolar world through multilateral arrangements. That's what China is interested in. And at the same time, the United States is, well, we shouldn't speak too soon, but the United States is certainly looking like it's retreating from wanting to dominate the world, or this universal approach to the world, because its own internal contradictions and the problems universalism had caused the United States internally. So there are many forces within the United States saying, hey, look, the American empire, if you want to call it that, is being maintained at the expense of the American nation. So I actually think the trends in both countries are pointing towards a more inclusive world, if you will. I mean, for their own separate reasons. So I'm optimistic about a more inclusive world order, and more inclusive world order means to me a multipolar world.
But how would you then, you said that the US is looking at a more inclusive world, you know. In that sense, how would you then see other countries, major countries like India, playing a role in this?
I think there are several important trends in the world today. Okay, one obviously is China becoming more and more powerful, but that's leading to a more multipolar world. The U.S. retreating, that's leading to a more multipolar world because the U.S. used to want to dominate the world. So a third is, of course, the rise of the global South.
Yeah.
Okay, and that the global South, in its broadest definition, that's the entire world outside the Western world and plus Japan, basically. Okay, so and the global South includes, you know, the most populous nation in the world, India, includes the fastest growing second or largest economy in the world, depending on how you count, China, includes the poorest nations in Africa, but also wealthiest Saudi Arabia, UAE, and military power like Russia. So it's extraordinarily pluralistic and diverse. So the rise of the global South by itself is a huge force towards a multipolar and more inclusive world. And India, of course, is one of the major players in the global South, in BRICS, in all the global South institutions. So India, I think, will be instrumental in constructing a more inclusive world order.
Martin, let me ask you then, how do you see other countries playing a role in the U.S. China dynamic as we see right now?
I think it's not bad for the world that the entire system is getting less centralized. Because if you have the hub and spoke system that you have today, it's really hard to interact with countries which are not sitting at the nodes of these networks. But if you can have a matrix-like structure with everybody talking to everybody, building diplomatic, economic, higher education, other relationships, then that could, at the end of the day, produce a much bigger common good for all of us because there's more opportunity to cooperate, there's more opportunity to utilize and use globalization, there's more opportunity to use our comparative advantages. And obviously, even if you look around today, you see that certain countries are good at producing certain things, but they all of a sudden cannot produce, I don't know, aircraft engines out of nothing from one day to another, therefore they have to buy it from somewhere. And if we can use these advantages in a mutually beneficial way, that leads to better welfare for our people, that leads to a higher standard of living, that leads to bigger food security, and so on and so forth. I think the trick will be, and I tend to agree with Eric on that, is that how we can understand this very quickly changing setup, which is the global system. I agree that the US might retreat a little bit to focus on its internal problems. And if you look at it deep down, that was the ticket on which Donald Trump got elected by a convincing majority a couple of weeks ago, because he wants to fix America first. And maybe it's time to fix America first, because they have all these internal contradictions. And I'm quite sure that they're going to emerge from this situation stronger as they entered it, because this is how the Americans always did it. They always been facing crises, and then they emerged stronger once they were over. The trick for us Europeans will be that whether we can have the same amount of self-reflection when it comes to what have caused that kind of economic and social misery that we're currently in, how we can adjust those very ideologic policies that we have on the European Union's level, which are clearly not serving the interests either of the European people or the European industry and businesses, and how we can, for example, maintain a mutually beneficial economic relationship with China. And if I look at the last couple of weeks, I see EV tariffs coming in, I see the export of rare earth minerals being limited by the Chinese government. This is not the way to go, because this will reduce the overall amount of money and welfare which is available to all of our nations. And if Europe is to lose its biggest market, and then we're going to use the United States as well, because President Trump promised tariffs across the board once he gets to office, then you may start to ask questions that, okay, where the European economy is going, whether this is sustainable, whether we will remain competitive, and how that will reduce Europe's standing globally, and whether that will erode that kind of a credibility which has been significantly challenged in the last almost 3 years since the war in Ukraine and then the events in Gaza have started, because now it's out there for everybody to see how what kind of double standards Europe is using against the countries of the global south. And this is obviously not adding anything to the leverage that we have over some of these countries.
Absolutely. You spoke about our institutions. What implications do you think that countries like G2 frameworks have on multilateral institutions like the G20 or the United Nations in addressing global challenges? Is it relevant? Is it not relevant any longer?
I think the current system is outdated. We were just having a discussion on this earlier today that the world system as we know it was designed after the Second World War, and it was quite obvious who the winners of the Second World War have been. And obviously they designed an institutional system which served their interest. Of course, the relative weight of these countries is much smaller at this time, and the enormous amount of frustration you see around the permanent membership of the UN Security Council clearly shows that. I don't believe in institutions for the sake of institutions. So I think if we are to reform this, we have to have an incremental approach focusing on the very tangible deliverables. And on that regard, I think the AIIB, for instance, is a very good example because it was established not that the global south will have its own development bank. It was established to solve very tangible problems in the countries which are the stakeholders and the shareholders of this financial institution. And I think through this kind of approach, which uses the institutions to further national interest, it will be also easier to get nations signed up to all these projects because they would not enter these formations in order to have a large set of rules binding their hands, but they will enter these institutions to serve their own national interest. And I think we should bring the idea of national interest back into the discussion. And the next decade will be about how we rectify these national interests so they would lead us in the same direction instead of opposition all the time.
Well, Eric, let me ask you the same question. What is your point of view? Do you think that, international organizations and institutions like this need revamping?
I think international institutions certainly need to be reformed. The last several decades, post-Cold War, we've had a situation where all the rules and institutions are set up to enforce one set of standards in all dimensions. It's unbelievable. And somehow to deny many countries who are at totally different stages of their development with totally different cultural backgrounds, to force them into one mode of doing things and one mode of being. And that's proven to be a miserable failure. And so the ethos of these institutions need to be reformed. I think that the purpose of multilateral institutions is right, but their ethos need to be reformed to allow room for different countries, different peoples to pursue their own paths that are suitable to them. Okay, so that's why I think where the world ought to be going. And my second point is, having expressed optimism about a more inclusive world order, I think in the next years and maybe a decade to come, there will be fairly intense rivalries. We all know that. Let's be real about it. I don't spend too much time on interpreting the intention, but it's already happening. So in this kind of environment, I believe countries who can maintain their neutrality will benefit the most. Countries that are being forced to take sides will lose. If you're not one of the main players, okay, I'm talking about middle powers and small countries. If you cannot maintain your sovereignty, if you cannot sort of say, hey, I'm going to do what's best for my people and be neutral, and if you're forced to choose sides, you lose. So neutrality, I think, will be a prized asset, but it takes finesse and political will and sovereignty to do that.
Strategic autonomy.
Yes.
To be able to.
Yes, strategic autonomy, political autonomy, cultural autonomy, and uphold your own values. Those are the countries that will win.
Absolutely, but that also in a changing global world order would mean mutual respect for the values and principles
of course.
that come.
That's right.
Let me come to you again, end with my last question because we are very limited on time. Do you think a new world order of tariffs increasing or decreasing will increase or decrease economic security for nations like Europe, Africa, or the Indo-Pacific?
Just to very quickly reflect on what Eric just said, I'm reading a book by a former diplomat of Singapore, and Singapore is a small nation. And he put it really nicely that if you're a small country and you end up in a position where you have to make either or choices between the two great powers, then you messed up something years ago.
Absolutely.
Because you don't want to end up in that situation. And I think you're absolutely right that those countries who have the willingness and the political willingness as well to stand on their own feet and think, because that's not in fashion anymore in most of the countries, will have an advantage over everybody else. And this brings me to your question as well. Of course, if the amount of friction increases in global trade, that is not good overall. And I see certain risks around that, and it will hurt the least developed countries the most. So I have fears that Africa will not benefit from this. And of course, they have lesser options when it comes to how they engage certain major powers, because they might have fallen victim of certain value chains that they have inherited from the colonial period or even before that. So for them, breaking out from these circles is much more complicated. What I do not see, unfortunately, from the side of the West is that how we can meaningfully engage these countries, because we don't have any message to sell for them. We are, through our credibility, nobody really believes us anymore. We don't have any military might to coerce them to do things that they might want or wouldn't like to do. And I think Western Africa is a great example of that in the last couple of years, that how France has lost its sway over these countries, which is not a bad thing after all, because it increases the autonomy and the independence of these countries. But if I look at the European economic interest, obviously it raises strong question marks when I look at the French nuclear industry, for instance. So maybe tariffs will provide to be something good at the end of the day, bringing a little bit of justice into the system in a way that it will make countries rethink that where their real interests are, and they can realign their trade policies as well. But in the short run, it's going to hurt all of us. And I think the European Union is not really missing the point when it is entering a trade war with China, and might enter a trade war with the United States and a bunch of other countries. God knows, we will see in the future as well, because Europe grew big because of trade. And if we stop trading, well, looking at the amount of natural resources we have in the old continent, the question arises at what the hell we're going to do if we're not going to trade. Because, I mean, we cannot sell services to each other all the time. We cannot cut each other's hair to raise our GDP.
Absolutely. I'd like to ask you the same question.
Yes, I think every country should do what's best in its own best interest. That's probably the first principle. And second is, it seems to me that the two forces that are shaping our world today are the forces of deglobalization and the force of reglobalization. Okay? And at the moment, the West is leading a deglobalization trend for their own reasons, because they deindustrialize. I can go on and on why. Okay? It's led to great inequality.
You guys are just too successful.
Yeah, internal contradictions, all that stuff, okay, for their own reasons. Which is fine. But from the Chinese perspective, China depends on economic interconnectivity with the rest of the world for its own continued development. So China must push for reglobalization. And that's, I think, what China has in common with the global South and maybe with parts of Europe, because all these three actors, well, China is part of global South, but we all need trade. We all need interconnectedness to further our development, to raise the standard of living for our peoples. I sometimes joke, America is very lucky. It doesn't need the world. It has oceans on both sides. It has an agricultural, nation. A lot of agriculture has had energy underneath. It's energy sufficient, self-sufficient. So it could say goodbye and retire and live happily ever after by themselves. But China cannot. We're the largest trading nation in the world and in history. Europe probably cannot, like you said, and global South certainly cannot. So we need to push for reglobalization, and I think that's upon us.
Well, on that note, I think, it's a very positive note that we're ending this on. And, I think we started the Budapest Global Dialogue with Mr. Oban saying this is the age of sovereignty. And I think with respect to that, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.